heard Jesus say this, I will destroy this temple that people have made, right? This gorgeous temple that in the Jewish faith was the center of their religious faith. I'm going to destroy this temple that people have made. And 3 days later, I'm going to build another temple that nobody, no man has made. No, not made by people. Now, Peter knew that wasn't what Jesus had said. But as he watched it, he says, the good thing was, even their testimony didn't agree. So this council, this group of religious leaders couldn't find a basis legally within their system. And they were stuck. So finally, the high priest seems like he's had enough. He's had enough of this guy named Jesus and all the problems he's caused, all the problems he's causing right now in Jerusalem, right? This is their chance to get him. And he walks up to Jesus, and I imagine at this moment, he is just so beyond himself. I think he gets right, and Jesus says, listen, aren't you going to answer? Aren't you going to answer all these accusations? Don't you have something to say about their charges, their testimony against you? To which Peter says, you would have thought Jesus would say something, right? But Jesus doesn't say anything. He doesn't answer at all. And maybe the reason Jesus doesn't answer is there is no testimony. There isn't two witnesses who have said, this is what he's done. So there's no reason for him to give any testimony. To which I think at this moment, this really ticks off the high priest. Because he's like the most important person in that religious faith. I mean, he's the kind of guy that as he walks down the streets, people part for him, right? People give him lots of respect. Nobody, doesn't respond to him. When he asks a question, people respond. He's used to that. And here's a guy that won't say anything. So he steps up to Jesus and he asks another question. And Peter hears it. And here's the question. Are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And he isn't asking it because he's curious if this is true. He's asking because this is the story that's been out there. And I've had enough. Are you? And tell me right up. To which Jesus, Peter hears astonishingly, says, I am. Which doesn't hit us in English as the way it would have hit them 2,000 years ago. Because those two words are the words that will convict him. Because those two words are the name that God gave to Moses to tell the Israelites when they were in Egypt. When he went back to say, hey, guys, I'm sent by God to take you out. And they're like, tell us which God, because there's like lots of gods here in Egypt. Which God? And he told Moses to say, I am, right? I am who I am. Tell the people, the God that's coming to get you is the I am God, right? I am God. And Jesus says, I am. And Peter says when the high priest hears this, he goes ballistic, right? He rips his clothes because that was a sign of great pain and frustration and anger. And he rips his clothes and he says, why do we need any more witnesses? And his point is, we don't need to find two people that agree because, listen, you all heard the blasphemy. You all heard it together. Now we have lots of witnesses who heard the exact same things. So what is your verdict? There's no need for a trial. We've all heard this stuff. We got two witnesses. In fact, we got more. All of us are witnesses. What's our verdict? And they all agreed that Jesus was guilty and he deserved to die because he had the audacity to say that he was the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One. In fact, this doesn't end at this moment. In fact, this just sets off a night that keeps getting worse and worse because now the people are sort of free. And some of them, Peter says, they would come up and they spit at Jesus. And I don't know if you ever had anybody spit at you, but it's not a pleasant thing, right? It's just this disgusting thing, and it's sort of the sign of, you're nothing. And when they're spitting at him, they can't wait to get home. In fact, somebody puts a blindfold on him, and everybody beats him with their hands and saying, prophesy, tell us which one of us hit you. You're so great, tell us all this stuff. And they're pummeling this guy. And then the guards lead Jesus away, and they beat him as well, which kind of seems an overkill, but it gets worse. And this is where we were last week, that when all this is happening, Peter's out in the courtyard. You remember, this servant girl from the high priest? This is the high priest's palace, right? She walks by and sees Peter there and kind of looks at him, gets a little closer and looks at him closer. And he's like, go away, And she's like, hey, you're also with Jesus, right? You're one of them, right? And the whole thing unfolds. And 3 times he hears people saying, hey, you're one of them, right? But Peter denies it all, which sets Peter up for this moment that would forever remind him of his past the rest of his life. This moment when he not only let Jesus down, he let himself down because he was sure that he was going to be right there for Jesus. As strong as his faith was in himself, it wasn't enough when the guards came and grabbed Jesus. And so the night goes on, Peter says to Mark, and Mark writes it down, tells us very early in the morning. This has gone all through the night. Now it's getting early in the morning. The chief priests, the elders, the teachers of law, again, all these really important people. In fact, all the Jewish council, all the Sanhedrin decided what to do with Jesus. Here's what they decide. They say, we're going to bound him up, we're going to tie him up, and we're going to lead him away. We're going to take him to Pilate, the governor. Because in their context, even though they've said he's guilty of death, they can't carry out the death sentence, which was this constant sort of irritation for them, that they're reminded that in their own country, they're not even in charge they can't do the things they want to do in their own country. They have to go to Pilate, this governor who's been put over them. To which Pilate, by the way, loves this, because he loves that anytime the Jews would come to him to ask him for something, because he could kind of mess with them. He could kind of remind them how important they were, as the Romans were to the Jews, how, all the stuff they brought them, the system they brought them, the order they brought them, all this stuff, right? So they have to go face Pilate. And when they bring Jesus and put him in front of Pilate, Peter says, Pilate asked him this question: are you the king of the Jews? Because that's what he'd been hearing, right? In fact, when they bring him, they said, he claims to be the king of the Jews. And so he just asked Jesus straight out, are you? To which Jesus answers in a weird way. He says, well, those are your words. Because Jesus never says, I'm king of the Jews. It's the idea that people put him. And again, it comes, the disciples had this idea. They thought when they got to Jerusalem, this was great because now the kingdom was going to come, right? The king was going to be revealed, the Messiah was going to show up, and everything was going to be great. And he didn't. Not in the way they thought, and it wasn't. Those are your words, he says to Pilate, which I think takes Pilate back a little bit, like, whoa, that's a weird answer. And the chief priests, they can't wait. They just start, accusing Jesus of all these different things, and they're just talking and going crazy. And Pilate's finally like, okay, enough of that, quiet down. He asked Jesus, after hearing all these people yell all these different accusations at him, aren't you going to answer this? I'm going to give you a chance to respond to all this stuff that they're saying about you. But Peter says, Jesus again doesn't say anything, which surprised Pilate. And surprised Pilate not because Jesus didn't say anything, but surprised because this was the normal time when somebody stood in front of Pilate, they began to beg. And whether they begged for freedom or whether they begged simply for a quick death, not a long, slow death, but just let my death be quick, that's what he was used to. And the fact that Jesus would not even respond to this group of people. And so the story goes on, that Pilate's there and the Jewish leadership are yelling and screaming. There's this crowd that's now gathered, and they're getting boisterous, right? And they have this practice there. Pilate has established it a few years before, where during Passover, as a way to sort of placate the masses, right? He'll free somebody who's been put in jail. Normally it was somebody who was an insurrectionist, somebody who had done something that was against the Roman government, and they put them in prison, and they would let them out, and it was a way to kind of appease the people who didn't think they should be there. And so Pilate now asked the crowd, because they got to choose who they want to be released. So what should I do? What should I do with this man you call the king of the Jews? And they say those fateful words. If you read the story before, you know where it goes, right? They all shouted at him, crucify him, kill him. To which I love how Peter remembers Pilate responded, because here's how Pilate responds. Why? I mean, what has this guy done? What's evil has this man done? What's the matter? I mean, even if he claimed to be king of the Jews, that's a us problem. That's not a you problem. Why is this such a big deal to you? Which doesn't calm the crowd. In fact, Peter says the crowd just gets louder and louder, and yelling, crucify him, just gets louder and louder. So Peter says, Pilate seemed to want to satisfy the crowd that day. So he frees Barabbas, this guy that he gave the choice between Jesus and this guy named Barabbas. They chose Barabbas. And so Pilate takes and he decides he'll have Jesus beaten with whips, because if he hasn't been beaten enough, they're going to beat him with whip. And then he hands him over to the soldiers to be crucified. And I wonder if Pilate didn't have Jesus beat just simply to maybe hope that the crowd would kind of say, okay, he suffered enough, right? Because being whipped back then was a way that oftentimes led to somebody's death. So he may die anyways. But Peter says that isn't where it ends. In fact, after he gets whipped, the soldiers take him out into the courtyard. In fact, they call all the soldiers that are on duty. And the thing to remember at this moment, history tells us that these weren't all Roman centurions. These weren't Roman citizens who were part of guards. In fact, Pilate had a lot of his army was staffed by other countries they had conquered. Oftentimes they were people that were from the next couple of countries over or the next country over, so that they sort of had animosity, so that they wouldn't kind of be easier on this group of people. In fact, they'd have a hatred. And so these were people from Samaria and those kind of places that were now his guards, right? And that explains why these guards seem to take great relish in punishing Jesus, the king of the Jews, because if this guy's the king of the Jews, they hate the Jews, let's punish him. So they get all the soldiers together, they put a purple robe on Jesus, they make some crown out of this prickly, thorny branches, and they stab it on his head. And they begin to, salute him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews," right? And they beat him on the head with a stick. And they spit on him, and they make fun of him, and they bow down to, worshiping him. And it's the part of the story that we don't really like to think about, because again, it's just this terrible, cruel moment. When all this horrific stuff is happening, you keep asking why. Why are they going to such extremes? Why are they making him suffer so much? I mean, crucifixion was going to be bad enough, but to go through all this before being crucified, being beaten and then being whipped and then now being, beaten some more. So finally they finish with all this, and they take off the purple robe and they put his own clothes back on him. And they lead him out to the place to be crucified. And then Peter says, we've been up all night, right? We started the night before. We went out, we had a late, supper, last supper, right? We've gone out to the garden, Jesus gets arrested, then he gets taken to all these different people's places. Finally we get out, and it's 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified Jesus. And it's interesting as much detail that Peter gave us about what happened to Jesus when he was in those courtyards. He doesn't give us much details about crucifixion. And the reason he doesn't give us much details about the crucifixion is everybody who was hearing this story, during Peter's days or even the next, few decades knew what crucifixion, nobody had to describe what crucifixion. Everybody knew how bad it was. Everybody knew somebody who had probably been crucified, or at least had seen a crucifixion and the results of it, had walked by people who were up there hanging, as a reminder, as a warning to anybody else who might mess with Rome. So they didn't need to go into great detail because everybody just knew from own experience how gruesome it was. So 9 o'clock in the morning, they nail Jesus to this cross, they put it in the ground, and on top of him, they put a sign of the charge that was against Jesus. This was the reason he was being crucified. And I think Pilate personally said, write this on there, because it was, again, an affront to the Jews. He said, here's the charge against him. He was the king of the Jews. Which is like, no, he's not our king. He says, well, that's the charge you brought, right? That's what got you so upset. So that's what he is. And that's why he's dying, because you wanted him to die for that. Peter said they also brought out two other guys. Two were robbers, who also the word could be insurrectionists, which makes a little more sense. He puts them on a cross beside Jesus. And they're all now hanging there, slowly dying. And I think Peter is probably not real close. He's sort of back in the crowd, kind of trying to just watch things, observe things, but doesn't want to get called out. And people walk by Jesus. They insult him, they say stuff, they shake their heads, say whatever they were saying back there. And they remind him of the things that they had heard he had said. They said, you said you could destroy the temple and build it again in 3 days. So, come on down from your cross, save yourself, right? You said you had the ability to do this, now show us your ability. But Peter says it wasn't just the crowd. In fact, the religious leaders don't miss their opportunity either. In fact, they say the chief priests, the teachers of the law, were also making fun of Jesus, Peter says. And here's what they said to him. They said, he saved other people, but he can't save himself. And I think as Peter thinks back now 30 years after this, I think maybe he smiles when he tells Mark this, because it dawns on him that they were right. The religious leaders actually got some part of this right? Because he saved others so he couldn't save himself. Because if he had saved himself, he couldn't save us. So they were right when he says, he saved others, he can't save himself. They're exactly right, he couldn't. And he wouldn't because that's part of what was happening. In fact, they go on to say, listen, if he is really the Christ, really the Messiah, the King of Israel, let him come down from the cross, right? If you're really what you've been saying is what we've said you are, the King of the Jews, right? Come down. And when we see this, we will believe in him. Come on, Jesus, come on down. If you do this, we're going to believe in you. And again, I think Peter would smile because he'd say, again, they were right. They were batting 1,000, which is crazy. Because he said, Jesus would. He would come down, right? And people would. People would believe in him. And what Peter saw 2 days later was why he continued to believe 30 years later. Because the stuff they had said about him was true, even though they couldn't see it. But to make matters worse, not only did the crowd give him to not only religious leaders, but Peter says the audacity of these two robbers, these two insurrectionists who were being crucified beside him, they also begin to taunt him. Which seems like a weird thing to be doing, right? You're hanging on a cross, you can barely breathe, and you think, hey, this makes sense. My last few breaths of life, or maybe last few hours of life, I'm going to make fun of the guy next to me, right? It just adds to this whole really weird scene that day. So Peter says for 3 hours this goes on, and at noon, the whole country becomes dark. And then this darkness lasted for 3 hours. So for another 3 hours, for now 6 hours, Jesus had been hanging on this cross, which we think that's a long time, but there are stories that people could be crucified for more than a day, sometimes for a couple of days. They could somehow, keep pulling themselves, somehow survive. The will to live kept them pushing ahead, even though there was no chance for survival. But 6 hours sounds painful. Peter says, as everything's kind of dark now, all of a sudden Jesus cries in this loud voice. These words that if you've read this part of the story, and they're just words that seem so painful. He says, my God, why have you abandoned me? Why have you forsaken me? Why have you left me, right? And I think Jesus said those words for a couple of reasons. I think in that moment, he was feeling abandoned, right? Because now he's by himself, it feels like. Everybody's against him. The crowd's against him. The religious leaders the guys that are dying next to him are against him. But I also think that Jesus is doing something that first century rabbis often did, which was to quote the starting line of a psalm or of a part of a Bible story, knowing that people would know the rest of the story. Because here he's actually quoting the first line of a psalm, of a song that a guy by the name of David, who had written 1,000 years before. And if you go read Psalm 22, it's pretty incredible how David's song that he wrote 1,000 years before this has so many elements that match what Jesus was experiencing. He'll talk about, the people that are mocking him, that are spitting at him, that are laughing at him, that are making a mockery of him. He'll talk about, having his clothes divided up. He talks about all these things that Jesus experiences there. But what if when Jesus says, my God, why have you abandoned? Why have you forsaken me? He's reminding them also that if they'll take the moment to go and look at that story, how it ends up says that everybody will hear about my story. That future generations will know about the goodness of this person. In fact, if you go read the last few words of that song, it ends, and some translations will translate this, it ends this way: it is finished. And I don't think Jesus necessarily orchestrated all this up. I just think in the moment he is reminded of this song that is one of those heartbreaking songs that does get us to a point that there is hope even beyond what we're experiencing in the moment. And it's a great reminder because the reality is, maybe God feels silent for us. Maybe right now for you, it just feels like God has gone silent. Maybe life feels heavy. There's all the stuff going on, the stuff that's out of our control, the stuff that other people are deciding for us. Maybe we've wondered, where God is or if he still cares. Maybe we feel just like Jesus, right? My God, why have you abandoned me? Why have you forsaken me? Why have you left me alone? And I think when Peter hears this and thinks about it 30 years later, it reminds him that he had been there, not just there when all this took place, but there and feeling like he was lost and abandoned by God. And so had Jesus. Even Jesus had felt that. And then Peter says, then Jesus cries in this loud voice. And this time he dies. He expires. He breathes his last breath. I think he tells Mark then, hey, Mark, there's something else that happened that we didn't know about in the moment, but we knew about later, but just write it down, right? Because, here's what we heard, that at the very same moment, the curtain in the temple was torn in two pieces, which is pretty incredible because it's a big, heavy curtain, been hanging up there for, a long, long time. But it was torn not from the bottom up, but from the top down, symbolizing that this was a supernatural event, that this temple was ripped open. Now, Peter doesn't tell us which of the curtains in the temple. There are two. There's one that separates the holy place from the rest of the temple, and then there's a most holy place, an inner chamber in that temple that only the priest on certain days went into. We don't know which one of those tore up, but the reality is it doesn't matter which one was torn up because it was symbolizing that things have been ripped apart. It wasn't symbolizing just that Jesus died. It was symbolizing that things had changed. That this good news that Mark had talked about in the very first chapter had happened. That the time is near. That the kingdom is close. That God is doing something. We ought to open our hearts and lives up to it. Then Peter adds another interesting scene because maybe at this point when Jesus cries out, it just is so hard on Peter that he doesn't turn and run away, but he actually is sort of pulled in closer to where Jesus is at. Because here's what he says. He says, there was a centurion who was standing right in front of the cross. And when he had seen all this happen and all the stuff that people had said and then how Jesus had died, right? Not just what happened when he saw how he died, but how he had died. That he hears the centurion say, this man really was the Son of God. And maybe he said it just loud enough for the people closest to hear, for them to hear, but what an incredible statement for a Roman centurion to make about a guy who's dying. Well, the next morning rolls up. The rest of the day is a terrible day. The next day is a terrible day. And then on Sunday it shows up, right? Jesus dies on Friday. Saturday, there's everybody's hiding out. Nobody knows what to do. They're heartbroken. Sunday morning, the women decide that the guys haven't done a very good job on Friday getting the body ready for burial. So they decide they're going to go and do it right. So they go real early in the morning. When as they're getting close to the tomb, they're like, we had a problem because when we get there, the tomb had this big rock that was in the front of it. How are we going to move it, right? Because, it's really big. It's going to be really hard for us. We maybe can't even do it. So they're saying, when we get there, who's going to roll the stone away that covers us, right? Because it's going to be impossible. But as they're thinking this over, when they get there, they see that the stone had already been rolled away. Even though it was very large, that somebody had already opened the door for them, which was like, that's kind of weird. And then Peter says, here's the story we heard, that when the women entered the tomb, they saw a young man wearing a white robe and sitting on the right side. And I love what Peter says because it's the regular response of people when they are in the presence of an angel, because it seems like they're kind of describing an angel, a young guy wearing a white robe, sitting on the right side. Because Peter says, no, that they saw him, they were afraid, they were alarmed, which seems to be a normal response when people encounter angels. To which the angel says exactly what every angel seems to say in these moments. which is like a little late, isn't it? Couldn't you just open with that, like as we're walking in, don't be afraid, but no, you're gonna let us get, it's like, don't be afraid, right? Don't be afraid. You are looking for Jesus from Nazareth, who's been crucified. But the good news is he is risen from the dead. He is not here. He's not here. So what you need to do is go tell his followers, his disciples, and Peter. And I love this, that Peter, I think when the ladies tell him the story, Peter says, wait, time out, before you go any farther, tell me that part again, right? Now go and tell his followers and Peter, because Peter, thought he was on the outs. Even 30 years later, I think it brings not just a smile to his face, I think it brings even a tear to his eye. To think that God would care enough about him to mention him specifically by name, not just the disciples, but to say disciples and Peter, right? Tell them that Jesus is going into Galilee ahead of them, and you will see him there as he told you before. Don't forget what Jesus had told you before. Because Peter would say that's sort of the running theme that he would tell us, and we would not think of it, right? We would forget it in those moments. See, the reality is Peter thought he had done the unpardonable. He had denied Jesus. He had run away in Jesus' biggest moment of need. He had failed, to stand up like he said he was going to stand up. He thought he had done the inexcusable, right? Because how do you excuse somebody who says, I'm always going to be with you, and when it happens, they're not there? He thought he had done the unforgivable. Because how do you forgive somebody who doesn't keep their word? Who breaks that trust? Who breaks that relationship? Peter thought he had done the unpardonable, the inexcusable, the unforgivable, and the reality was he hadn't. And here's where it crosses with us. What if we haven't either? No matter what's gone on in your life, what's going on in your life, what may go on in your life, there will be moments when we feel like, man, I've messed this up too much, right? I've gone too far. I've done too much. I keep doing that same thing over and over again. There's no hope for me. I said something I shouldn't have, and there's no way I can take it back. I failed in the biggest moments to stand up. And we can feel just like Peter, that we've done the inexcusable, the unpardonable, the unforgivable. But I think if Peter was sitting here today, he would say, but what if we haven't? And he would know that from personal experience because he was reminded as much as he felt like he had and felt like he should be unforgiven, he was. See, what if denying, disowning, disobeying Jesus isn't enough to be abandoned by him? Now, some of us push back on that, saying, well, no, like don't give people a pass. No, that's Peter's pass, right? Because Peter disowned Jesus. He denied Jesus. He disobeyed Jesus. He forgot all the stuff Jesus said, don't forget this. And Peter's like, forget what, right? What if we haven't gone too far, done too much to be forgiven? Because here's the reality. While our past will always be part of us, it doesn't have to define us. Because what if it isn't the only story of our life? Something to think about today.